onto Marinka, which may well be an approximation of hell. Murad Gazdiev, RT from Marinka.
As the fighting continues on, multiple NATO states have one by one confirmed deliveries of tanks to Ukraine, with the US to send 31 Abrams and Germany agreeing to supply 14 Leopard 2 tanks. At the same time, the bloc claims it isn't a party to the conflict, something Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman branded an outright lie.
How can these people seriously say they're not side of the conflict as they aren't going to send troops and jets? And what about sending tanks? I'm just trying to find any logic, any sense in it. But there isn't any, and can't be. You need people for usage of tanks, their maintenance, giving them signals. This is pure hypocrisy, criminal hypocrisy, not just an attempt to avoid uncomfortable questions. It's outright lies. We hear it since the start of the conflict, while actions of the West prove the opposite. In fact, NATO and the West in general fight against us through Kiev nationalist regime.
Western tanks are to reach Ukraine at spring. That's the prognosis given by the Russian Federation Council member and former ambassador to the EU in an interview to RT.
You know, it takes several months to prepare tanks, to deliver them, and at least 3 months to train the tank crews. That training will probably begin in the immediate future, but the tanks themselves will take longer to arrive. When the first package of economic sanctions was introduced back in 2014, the official motivation behind that decision was to convince Russia to sit at a negotiating table with Ukraine. Those negotiations started and they were concluded early next year with the conclusion of the famous Minsk agreements, widely recognized as having been just an attempt to prolong the procedure in order to provide additional assistance to Ukraine and its armed forces. The Minsk agreements is a document endorsed by the UN Security Council in a unanimous vote in 2015. So, admitting that today, France, Germany, and now the United Kingdom, they admit at deliberately violating international law. The Minsk agreements were signed in February 2015. The EU, just a day or two later, introduced another set of sanctions. This is a policy that leads nowhere, and it only creates problems, and that is obvious if you look today at what's happening across the European Union.
In a US Senate hearing dedicated to the situation in Ukraine, America's senior diplomat Victoria Nuland couldn't hold herself back from celebrating the Nord Stream 2 pipeline blasts, as well as Washington's long-standing interference into the domestic politics of East European countries. RT contributor Rachel Marsden takes a closer look at Nuland's so-called achievements.
The U.S. Senate's Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on Thursday that kind of slipped under the radar in the mainstream press, but it's really a classic example of how Washington decision makers get drunk on their own nonsense and then just start trying to change the world. The subject of this hearing was countering Russian aggression, Ukraine and beyond. And despite being with the Democrats right now, Victoria F. the EU Nuland, we'll get to that in a second, who's now serving at the State Department as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Biden administration. Nuland can't help but side with Republican Senator Ted Cruz when it comes to being relieved that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that was supposed to send Russian gas into Europe via Germany was blown up.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
That would be Senator Ted Cruz representing the state of Texas. It's probably just a total coincidence that Cruz has spent years, since at least 2019, trying to get Nord Stream 2 sanctioned into oblivion, pretending that he's so concerned about Europe being too dependent on Russian gas, and that Texas is also the top producer of liquefied natural gas in the U.S., 25% of U.S. gas comes from Texas, and on which Europe is now totally dependent and at a much higher price than it's sold on the U.S. market. So Nuland was already singing from the same hymn book as Cruz on the topic of Nord Stream 2 way back in January of 2022. So even before the conflict in Ukraine went red hot.
I want to be clear with you today. If Russia invades Ukraine, one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward.
She sounds so confident. It's amazing that when the same pipeline was mysteriously blown up last year, the mainstream Western press didn't circle back and ask her what she meant by that statement. Instead, they apparently figured that it made so much more sense to accuse Russia of blowing up its own infrastructure. Nuland's boss, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, remarked after the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up that it offered, quote, tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. Yeah, sure, tell that to Europeans who are walking around in the dark and taking 10-second showers to keep energy costs down. Such a great opportunity. And since the Senate committee hearing is about countering Russia in Ukraine and beyond, well, Nuland is already bragging about Washington meddling in Belarus.
I would not say that we've had manifest success, but also working intensively with the Belarusian opposition.
It seems like Washington can't keep its hands off of Russia's neighbors. Nuland was spotted in Ukraine way back in 2014 handing out cookies to anti-government protesters and caught discussing the potential roles of Ukrainian opposition leaders post-regime change. Around that same time, a recording leaked of Nuland expressing just how much she values U.S. allies and international law, even when they don't quite align with Washington's agenda for Kyiv.
That would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, the EU.
Nuland has come a long way from openly denouncing Europe for standing in the way to now being relieved that Europe's pipelines were blown up. This female Forrest Gump of regime change shenanigans certainly sounds like a true friend that only has allies' very best interests at heart.